The first thing my sister said after I caught her kissing my husband was not, "I'm sorry." She did not pull away. She did not cover her face. She looked down at the newborn sleeping in her arms, smiled at me, and said, "Our son gets Daniel's name. You can keep paying for the house until we're ready to move in." My husband stood beside her hospital bed with one hand resting on her shoulder. My mother closed the door behind me, and in that moment, I understood something worse than the affair. This was not a secret anymore. It was a plan. A plan my entire family expected me to accept. I placed the blue gift bag on the table, told them congratulations, and walked out without raising my voice. They thought I was too shocked to fight. They were wrong. I was quiet because I had just realized that the most dangerous person in that room was not my husband. It was me. My name is Claire Bennett. I was 38 years old, married for 11 years, and until that afternoon, I believed I had built a stable life in Raleigh, North Carolina. Daniel, my husband, worked in commercial lending. He liked to tell people he understood money better than anyone in the room. My younger sister, Vanessa, had always liked things that looked expensive. Whenever she ran out of money, my parents called me. Whenever she needed rent, my parents called me. Whenever she made a mistake, everyone expected me to clean it up. I was the dependable daughter. Vanessa was the exciting one. For most of my life, I believed that being dependable meant being loved. I did not understand that, in my family, it only meant being useful. 3 weeks before the baby was born, Vanessa told us the father had disappeared. She said he had been a man she met while traveling for work. She refused to give us his name. My mother cried for 2 days and then announced that the family would support Vanessa. Daniel was especially kind. He drove Vanessa to medical appointments when I was busy. He helped assemble the crib in the house I owned on Hawthorne Ridge. That house was supposed to be an investment property. I had purchased it before my marriage using money my grandmother left me. Daniel and I had lived there for 6 years before moving into a smaller townhouse closer to my office. We kept Hawthorne Ridge as a rental. Then Vanessa became pregnant and said she had nowhere safe to stay. My parents asked me to let her use the house for 6 months. I agreed. I even stopped collecting rent. I paid the mortgage, taxes, insurance, and repairs while Vanessa prepared for the baby. Standing in that hospital room, I finally understood why Daniel had volunteered to repair the nursery. He had not been helping my sister. He had been preparing a home for his second family. I made it to the parking garage before my hands began to shake. I sat behind the wheel and locked the doors. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. I watched her name flash across the screen. I did not answer. A message appears, "Do not make this ugly. Vanessa has just given birth." A second message came from Daniel. "We need to discuss this calmly. I never meant for you to find out this way." Then Vanessa sent a photograph. It showed Daniel holding the baby. Under it, she wrote, "He looks like his father, doesn't he?" I stared at the picture until the shock inside me became something colder. I opened my email and searched for the contact information of a woman named Marjorie Sloan. Marjorie had handled my grandmother's estate 15 years earlier. She had once told me, "Claire, if someone ever makes you feel foolish for protecting what belongs to you, protect it twice." I called her. She answered on the 4th ring. "Claire, I need to know exactly how the Hawthorne Ridge house is titled." Her voice changed immediately. "Where are you?" "In my car." "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Is Daniel with you?" "Good. Do not go home. Do not sign anything. Do not move money. Come to my office." I looked back toward the hospital entrance. My father was standing outside beneath the covered walkway. He saw my car. For 1 second, our eyes met through the windshield. He did not come toward me. He lowered his head. That hurt more than I expected. I started the engine and drove away. Marjorie's office was above an old bookstore in downtown Raleigh. When I arrived, she had already pulled a thick file from storage. She placed it in front of me and opened the first page. "Hawthorne Ridge was purchased through the Claire Bennett Separate Property Trust," she said. "Your grandmother designed it that way because the inheritance was yours alone. Daniel's name is not on the deed." "No. Can he claim part of it because we are married?" "He can try. But the trust is clear, and you have never mixed the property income with marital accounts." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Then Marjorie turned another page. "There is something else you should see." It was a copy of a document dated 6 weeks earlier. A transfer request. Someone had tried to move the house from my trust into a new company, called North Pine Family Holdings. The signature at the bottom looked like mine. It was not mine. I read the page twice. Where did this come from? The county title office contacted me, because the trust requires independent confirmation before any transfer. I rejected it. "Why didn't you call me?" "I did. 3 times. I checked my call history. There was nothing. Then I remembered that Daniel had replaced my phone after mine stopped charging. Marjorie slid another document across the desk. This was attached to the transfer request. It was a letter claiming I had medically unable to manage my own property. My husband was listed as temporary financial representative. A doctor's signature appeared at the bottom. I knew the doctor's name. Dr. Aaron Pike. He was Vanessa's obstetrician. My stomach turned. Daniel was not simply planning to leave me. He and Vanessa had tried to take my house by claiming I was mentally unfit. And suddenly, Vanessa's words made perfect sense. You keep paying for the house until we're ready. They believed the transfer was already complete. They believed the house belonged to their holding company. They believed I was only the person paying the bills. Marjorie leaned back. Claire, how much access does Daniel have to your business? He handles some vendor financing. He has access to one operating account. How much money is in it? Usually to $200,000 and $300,000. She reached for the phone. Call your accountant now. My accountant? Luis Ortega answered immediately. When I asked him to review every transaction Daniel had approved during the past year, he became silent. Then he said, Claire, I was going to call you tomorrow. My heart sank. What happened? There are several payments I cannot explain. They were approved through Daniel's credentials, but the invoices look unusual. How much? At least $180,000. The room seemed to tilt. Where did it go? Mostly to renovation companies and a private furniture supplier. I already knew the answer. Hawthorne Ridge. My company had paid to renovate the house where my husband planned to live with my sister and their child. I closed my eyes. Marjorie placed a hand on the file. Do not confront them yet. I looked at her. They are in my house. For tonight? Yes. They stole from my business. We will document it. They forged my signature. We will prove it. And my entire family knew. Marjorie's expression softened. That part may not have a legal remedy. I stared at the fake signature again. No, I said. But it will have a consequence. That night, I checked into a hotel under my maiden name. Daniel called 17 times. Vanessa sent me a list of items the baby needed. My mother sent a long message explaining that love was complicated, that Daniel had always wanted children, and that I should not punish an innocent baby because my marriage had changed. That sentence told me how long they had been preparing their excuses. Daniel and I had tried to have children during the first 5 years of our marriage. After 2 miscarriages, I stopped trying. He held me in the hospital and told me I was enough. Now my mother was using that pain to explain why my husband had made a baby with my sister. I saved every message. At 1:12 in the morning, Luis called. We found something worse, he said. I sat up in bed. What? Daniel opened a line of credit using Bennett House Studios receivables as security. The balance is $420,000. My mouth went dry. I never approved that. I know. What did he use the money for? Property development company called North Pine. The same company that had tried to take my house. Daniel and Vanessa had not just planned a new family. They had planned a new business financed by mine. And according to Luis, the loan payment was due in 12 days. If it was not paid, the bank could seize money coming into my company. 12 days. That was how long I had before everything I built could collapse. I looked at the photograph Vanessa had sent me. Daniel held the baby like a proud father. They believed they had already won. I whispered into the dark room, enjoy the house. Then I called Marjorie again. I know what my final gift is going to be. The next morning, I moved quickly. Luis froze Daniel's access to the company accounts. Marjorie contacted a forensic document examiner. A second attorney filed an emergency notice against any transfer involving Hawthorne Ridge. We also contacted the bank that issued the line of credit. The loan officer sounded nervous when she learned I had never authorized it. By noon, the bank had suspended North Pine's account and opened an internal fraud investigation. Daniel noticed the frozen access at 12:43. He called me from a number I did not recognize. I answered. Claire, what did you do? His voice was sharp, not apologetic thing. That told me protected my company. You are overreacting. You had a child with my sister. Silence. Then he lowered his voice. This relationship happened because our marriage had been dead for years. That explains the affair. It does not explain the forged signature. Another silence. Longer this time. I don't know what you think you saw. I saw the transfer request for Hawthorne Ridge. He breathed out slowly. Vanessa and the baby need stability. So you tried to steal my house. We were reorganizing the property by declaring me mentally unfit. That was a legal strategy. It was never meant to hurt you. I almost laughed. Only Daniel could a strategy and expect me to be impressed. Who signed Dr. Pike's name? I'm not discussing this over the phone. Good. You can discuss it with the investigators. His tone changed. Claire, listen to me carefully. If you destroy North Pine, you will destroy your own company too. Why? Because the credit line is tied to your receivables. I know. That surprised him. I heard it in his breathing. He had expected me to remain confused. He had always mistaken my trust for ignorance. You need me to fix this, he said. No, Daniel. You need me not to expose it. He began to say my name, but I ended the call. 1 hour later, Vanessa called. She did not ask whether I was all right. She said, "You froze the money for the nursery. The nursery is in my house. You gave me permission to live here." I gave my pregnant sister temporary permission. I did not give my husband permission to move in and create a fraudulent company. You are being bitter because I gave him what you couldn't. The words landed exactly where she meant them to. For a moment, I could not speak. Vanessa knew about the miscarriages. She had sat beside me after the second one. She had held my hand while I cried. Now she used that memory like a weapon. I looked out the hotel window at people crossing the street below. Then I said, "You should pack." She laughed. "Mom said you would threaten us. But you can't remove a mother and newborn without notice." She is right. Vanessa became quiet. "So you admit it. I am not removing you today. Good. I'm giving you time to become comfortable." She did not understand what I meant. That was fine. I ended the call. Over the next 4 days, the investigation grew. The forensic examiner confirmed that my signature had been copied from an old insurance document. The bank discovered that Daniel had submitted false board minutes, showing that my company approved the loan. There was no board. I owned 80% of Bennett House Studio. Louis owned the remaining 20. Daniel owned nothing. He had created meeting minutes for a meeting that never happened. Then Louis found payments to Dr. Aaron Pike, 3 transfers, each one labeled consulting. When the attorney contacted him, Pike immediately hired his own lawyer. By the end of the week, we learned he had not signed the medical letter. His electronic signature had been taken from a form Vanessa received during treatment. That meant Daniel and Vanessa had forged the doctor's approval too. The criminal case was no longer a possibility. It was coming. But I still had one problem. The $420,000 line of credit was attached to my company. Even if the bank admitted fraud, resolving it could take months. My employees could lose their jobs before the investigation ended. I had 23 people depending on me. I could not let Daniel's betrayal destroy them. Louis and I spent 2 days reviewing contracts. Then we found the opening we needed. The loan agreement required the borrower North Pine to maintain ownership of the main asset listed in its development plan. That asset was Hawthorne Ridge. But North Pine did not own Hawthorne Ridge. The transfer had been rejected. Daniel had borrowed against a house his company never owned. The bank's own underwriting rules required the loan to be canceled if the collateral representation was false. Marjorie prepared the demand. The bank had 48 hours to release Bennett House Studios' receivables or face an emergency lawsuit and a report to federal regulators. They released them in 11 hours. My company was safe. Now I could focus on the people inside my house. On the 6th day, my mother announced a family meeting. She sent the invitation through a group message. Sunday dinner at Hawthorne Ridge. We will discuss a peaceful transition for everyone. A peaceful transition. They wanted me to sit at my own dining table while they explained how my husband, sister, and nephew would inherit my life. I accepted. Marjorie asked why. Because they still think this is a private family disagreement. I said. I want to hear exactly what they believe they are entitled to. Sunday evening, I drove to Hawthorne Ridge. The front garden had been redesigned. New white roses lined the walkway. My company had paid for them. Inside, the living room contained furniture from my warehouse. My company had paid for that too. Family photographs had already been moved. A framed picture of Daniel and Vanessa holding the baby stood on the mantel. My wedding photograph was gone. My mother greeted me at the door as if I were a difficult guest. "Please stay calm," she whispered. "I am calm. That is what worries me." My father sat at the dining table. He looked older than he had 1 week earlier. Vanessa entered carrying the baby. Daniel followed with his hand on her back. They had already become a couple in the way they moved together. No hesitation. No shame. My mother served roast chicken and poured wine. No one ate. Finally, Daniel placed a folder on the table. I prepared a separation proposal. I opened it. He wanted a divorce. He wanted me to assume the debt connected to Bennett House Studio. He wanted temporary use of Hawthorne Ridge for 5 years. After 5 years, he wanted the house transferred to the baby. He also wanted monthly support because he claimed he had helped grow my company. I turned the page. There was a confidentiality clause. I would not be allowed to discuss the affair of the child or the financial dispute. In exchange, Daniel would agree not to challenge my remaining business assets. I looked around the table. Did all of you read this? My mother nodded. It is fair. My father stared at his plate. Vanessa adjusted the baby's blanket. Daniel leaned back with the confidence of a man presenting a completed deal. I closed the folder. You stole money from my company, forged documents, and tried to take my house. Now you are offering not to steal anything else if I remain silent. Daniel's jaw tightened. Would invested that money in a future. My money. Our marital resources. The house is separate property. Not for long. Vanessa said. Everyone looked at her. She smiled. The transfer is already being processed. So they still did not know it had been rejected. They still believed North Pine owned the house. I looked at my mother. When did you learn about them? She folded her hands. About 4 months ago. And the baby? Daniel told us after the first ultrasound. My father closed his eyes. You all knew for months. My mother's voice became defensive. We were trying to avoid unnecessary pain. For whom? For the family. I am part of the family. Vanessa laughed softly. You always make everything about you. I looked at her. You are living in my house with my husband, using money stolen from my business, and holding a baby he made while married to me. But I am making this about me. Daniel stood. That is enough. No, I said. I agree. He paused. The room became still. I pushed the folder back toward him. I agree that this should end peacefully. My mother relaxed. Vanessa smiled. Daniel sat down again. I will not fight over the house tonight, I continued. You can stay until next Saturday. Vanessa blinked. Why next Saturday? Because the baby's welcome home party is next Saturday, isn't it? My mother looked surprised. How did you know? The invitations were printed by one of my vendors. Daniel's face hardened. The party was supposed to introduce the baby to friends, business contacts, and several investors. North Pine planned to announce its first luxury development project, Hawthorne Ridge itself. They intended to show guests the renovated house and present it as proof of their company's success. I stood. You wanted a peaceful transition. You will have 1 week. Daniel studied me. What are you planning? One final gift for the baby. Vanessa pulled the child closer. What kind of gift? I looked at the framed family photograph on the mantel. The truth about what his parents built for him. Then I left. The welcome home party began at 4 o'clock the following Saturday. By 3:30, cars lined both sides of Hawthorne Ridge. A white tent covered a backyard. A catering company arranged champagne beneath the oak trees. A photographer took pictures near a wooden sign that read, Wilson de Cole, th fires keep to our oath, a be beautiful legacy the than hurt, Ethan Daniel. My husband's name passed to my sister's son. But by then, pain was no longer controlling me. I had documents. I had witnesses. And I had the legal right to enter my own property. I arrived at 4:15 wearing a simple navy dress. Marjorie walked beside me. Louise followed carrying 2 document cases. Behind us came a county deputy and a representative from the bank's fraud department. Some recognized me. Most knew Bennett House Studio. Several had worked with Daniel. The conversations began to fade as we walked through the front gate. Vanessa stood beneath the tent wearing a cream dress. Daniel held the baby. My mother saw me first. She hurried across the lawn. Claire, this is not appropriate. I was invited to the family meeting. I assumed I was still family. This is the baby's day. No. This is North Pine's investor presentation. Her face changed. She knew I knew. Daniel handed the baby to Vanessa and approached us. He gave Marjorie a cold look. You brought a lawyer to a family celebration. She is also the trustee for Hawthorne Ridge. A few nearby guests turned toward us. Daniel lowered his voice. Leave now. Marjorie opened her case. That will not be happening. Vanessa stepped forward. You promised us 1 week. Yes, I said. The week is over. My father stood near the back door, looking as if he wanted to disappear. Daniel forced a smile for the guests. Everyone, please continue enjoying yourselves. My wife is having difficulty accepting our separation. There it was, the first public lie. He wanted to make me look emotional before I spoke. I walked toward the small place set up for the company announcement. A microphone stood beside a display showing architectural drawings for 6 luxury townhomes. At the top was the North Pine logo. Below it were the words Ehedu Arif Kala, Kamanig so on. They planned to demolish my grandmother's house. For 1 second, I saw myself at 9 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen while she taught me to make biscuits. She had left me the money that purchased Hawthorne Ridge. She had protected it in a trust. Daniel and Vanessa intended to tear it down and sell the land. I stepped onto platform and took the microphone. Daniel moved toward me. The deputy stepped between us. I looked across the yard. There were almost 100 guests. I began. My name is Claire Bennett. I own Bennett House Studio, and I am the legal owner of the property where you are standing. A murmur moved through the crowd. Daniel called out, "That is disputed." "No," Marjorie said from below the platform. "It is not." She handed the deputy a certified copy of the deed and trust record. I continued. "Many of you were invited today because Daniel Cole and Vanessa Bennett plan to announce a luxury development company called North Pine." One of the investors looked at Daniel. "That is correct," Daniel said. "Claire is upset because our marriage ended." "The marriage is ending. The fraud has already ended." The yard became silent. Louise began giving folders to the bank representative, investors, and reporters. Daniel's face lost color. "What is in those?" he demanded. "Copies of the documents you created in my name." Vanessa shook her head. "This is insane." I held up the first page. "This is a request to transfer Hawthorne Ridge from my private trust into North Pine Family Holdings. The signature is forged." I held up the second page. "This letter claims I was mentally unable to manage my own property. The doctor whose signature appears on it has confirmed that he never wrote or signed it." Wests began whispering. My mother pushed through the crowd. "Claire, stop. Think about the baby." "I am thinking about him." I looked at Vanessa. "One day, Ethan will ask why his parents lost this house. I want the answer to be clear." Vanessa's eyes filled with rage. "You cannot take his home." "I was never his home. It was property you occupied through my permission." Daniel climbed onto the platform. "This is a civil matter." The bank representative spoke from the crowd. Not entirely. Everyone turned. She identified herself and explained that North Pine had received a $420,000 credit line using false ownership records and fabricated company authorization. One investor immediately closed his folder. Another stepped away from Daniel. The third asked, "Did any of our deposits come from that loan?" Daniel did not answer. Louise did. "Yes. We traced 2 investor repayment checks to funds taken from Bennett House Studio." The investor's face darkened. "You used stolen money to make North Pine look profitable." Daniel pointed at me. "She is twisting everything." I looked at him. "Then explain the $180,000 in renovation invoices paid by my company." He said nothing. "Explain the furniture taken from my warehouse." Nothing. "Explain the false board meeting." His confidence began to break. "Claire, we can discuss this privately. You had 11 years to speak to me privately." Vanessa started crying. Not quietly. She held the baby against her chest and shouted, "You are humiliating us because you are jealous." I looked at her for a long moment. "I was jealous when I thought you had stolen my husband." She stared at me. "Then I saw the documents, and I realized you had only taken a man willing to forge his wife's name, steal from her employees, and use his own child as part of an investment presentation." Daniel's head turned toward her. For the first time, he looked angry with Vanessa instead of me. That told me their unity was already failing. I reached into the final document case. "This is the gift." I lifted a large white envelope with Ethan's name written on it. Vanessa looked confused. "What is that?" "A protected education trust." The crowd went quiet again. I explained that I had placed $25,000 into an account for Ethan. Neither Daniel nor Vanessa could access it. It could only be used for education or medical care when Ethan was older. My mother covered her mouth. Vanessa looked at the envelope as if it were an insult. "Why would you do that?" "Because he is innocent." For the first time that day, my voice shook. "He did not choose how he was born. He did not choose what you did. And he should not have to pay for it." I looked down at the envelope. "But this gift comes with no house, no business, and no silence." Then Marjorie stepped onto the platform. She announced that Vanessa's temporary occupancy permission had expired. A lawful notice had been served 3 days earlier through an attorney. The deputy was present to enforce a possession order. Daniel and Vanessa had 2 hours to remove personal items. Everything purchased by Bennett House Studio would remain on the property as evidence in the financial case. Vanessa screamed, "You cannot throw a newborn into the street." "My attorney arranged a furnished apartment for 30 days, I said. "The lease and keys are in the envelope." She stared at me. I had removed the excuse before she could use it. The baby would have shelter, they would have time. But they would not have my house. Daniel grabbed the microphone. "You think this makes you look generous. You are destroying a family." I took it back. "No, Daniel. I am ending the part where your family is funded by my destruction." 2 men in dark suits entered through the gate. They approached Daniel and asked him to step aside. They were investigators from the State Financial Crimes Unit. Daniel looked at Marjorie, then at Louise, then at me. His face changed from anger to fear. "Claire," he said quietly, "please." That was the first honest word he had spoken to me in years. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was asking me to save him from consequences. I stepped away. The investigators led him toward the driveway. Vanessa called his name, but he did not look back. My mother turned on me. How can you stand there and watch this? I looked at her, the same way you stood in that hospital room and watched them humiliate me. She stopped. My father finally walked forward. His eyes were wet. I should have told you. Less. I was afraid your mother would leave me. And so you helped them take my marriage, my business, and my house. He lowered his head. I believed he meant it. But regret after exposure is not courage. I'd hope you become someone who can live with that apology, I said. Then I stepped down from the platform. Around us, the celebration had collapsed. Guests left in small groups, reading the evidence as they walked. The white sign welcoming Ethan home stood near the roses. I asked a worker to leave it. The child had come home, just not to the future his parents had stolen for him. The legal process lasted 14 months. Daniel pleaded guilty to bank fraud, identity theft, and falsifying business records. He avoided the longest possible sentence by cooperating and returning information about 2 contractors who had helped create false invoices. He still went to prison. Vanessa was charged with conspiracy and forgery. Because she had no previous record, and because she was caring for an infant, she received supervised probation, community service, and a restitution order. My mother sold her vacation property to help Vanessa repay part of the money. For once, I did not stop her. My parents had spent their lives protecting Vanessa from consequences. Now protection had become expensive. Daniel and I divorced. He asked for spousal support. The judge denied it. He asked for part of Bennett House Studio. The judge denied that too. The evidence showed that he had damaged the company instead of building it. I kept Hawthorne Ridge. But I did not move back in. For several months, I could not walk through the nursery without hearing Vanessa's voice in the hospital. Our son gets his name. You keep paying for the house. Every room carried a memory I no longer wanted, so I made a different choice. I donated the use of the house to a local nonprofit that helped women leaving financially abusive marriages. The organization converted it into temporary housing for 3 mothers and their children. The nursery stayed a nursery. The guest rooms became safe bedrooms. The office became a place where women could meet attorneys and job counselors. I did not demolish the house. I changed what it meant. That was the part of my revenge no one expected. Daniel and Vanessa wanted Hawthorne Ridge to represent what they took from me. Instead, it became a place where other women learned how to take their lives back. Bennett House Studio survived. It did more than survive. The fraud investigation forced us to improve every system in the company. Lewis became my full business partner. We opened a second warehouse in Charlotte. I created a program that trained women returning to work after divorce or domestic abuse. Some people told me I had turned pain into purpose. For a long time, I was angry. I woke up angry. I worked angry. I signed divorce papers with my jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. Healing did not arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as small decisions. I stopped reading Daniel's letters. I stopped checking Vanessa's social media. I stopped answering my mother's messages the moment they appeared. I learned that peace was not something my family gave me. It was something I protected from them. 6 months after the sentencing, Vanessa asked to meet. We sat in a coffee shop halfway between our neighborhoods. She looked tired. Ethan was with a babysitter. For several minutes, she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Daniel told me you were going to leave him." I wasn't. He said the marriage was only business. It wasn't. He said the house would become his after the transfer. It didn't. She looked down at her hands. I wanted to believe him. You wanted my life. Her eyes filled with tears. I thought you had everything. I almost told her that I had miscarried twice. That I had spent years wondering whether my body had failed my marriage. That I had worked 16-hour days because building beautiful homes for other people was easier than sitting inside my own grief. But Vanessa knew all of that. She had simply decided that my pain did not count because my life looked successful from the outside. You could have asked me for help, I said. You always made me feel small. No. I stopped making myself smaller so you could feel comfortable. She flinched. Then she asked, "Do you hate Ethan?" The question broke something open in me. No. Will you ever see him? I don't know. He is your nephew. He is also a child connected to the deepest betrayal of my life. She began to cry. I did not comfort her. But I did not leave. After a while, I slid a copy of the Education Trust across the table. The account is growing. You will receive a statement every year. You cannot borrow from it. She touched the paper. Why are you still doing this? Because one day he may need proof that someone separated him from what his parents did. She looked at me. Can you ever forgive me? I answered honestly. Forgiveness is not the same as access. She nodded slowly. That was the last time we spoke for almost a year. My mother still sends birthday cards. My father calls once a month. Sometimes I answer. Sometimes I do not. I am no longer the dependable daughter who rushes to repair every family emergency. They call that cold. I call it recovery. On the second anniversary of the hospital visit, I stood outside Hawthorne Ridge while 3 children drew pictures with sidewalk chalk. One little girl had drawn a yellow house with a blue door. Her mother stood beside me. She had arrived at the house 6 weeks earlier with 2 suitcases and no bank account in her own name. That morning, she had accepted a full-time job. She thanked me for giving her a place to begin again. I looked at the house. The mortgage was still in my name, just as Vanessa had demanded. I was still paying for it, but not for her. Not for Daniel. Not for the life they tried to build from my humiliation. I was paying for locked doors that kept dangerous people out. For bedrooms where children could sleep without hearing adults fight. For a kitchen where frightened women made plans over coffee. For a future no one had forged. That was my final gift. Not the eviction. Not the eviction. Not the criminal exposure. Those were consequences. The gift was what I created after they failed to destroy me. Daniel gave his name to a child. Vanessa tried to take my home. My family tried to take my voice. But in the end, a name was all he had left. The home became a refuge. And my voice became the one thing none of them could ever own again.